This videotape has been produced to be used as an aid in demonstrating different tree care-related work, techniques, and skills. The videotape is intended for use only by or in conjunction with trained staff. It may be used as part of, but not as a replacement for, a comprehensive training program. The ideas, procedures, and observations demonstrated in the videotape must be analyzed and at times modified to meet the specific needs of the individual situation. While the video provides some detailed explanations and demonstrations about different equipment and techniques, actual use requires knowledge of and experience with the equipment and techniques prior to use in an actual work environment. Be sure to understand the proper use of all equipment required and use safe work practices at all times. Familiarize yourself with local, state, provincial, national, or federal government standards as applicable to the job assignment and requirements. Refer to your company employee training manual for the specific standards related to job performance, required and recommended personal protective equipment, and safe working practices related to the job assignment. The information and practices portrayed in this video are current as of time of production, which may or may not be the most effective or applicable at the date of viewing.
This video series comes with a fully illustrated workbook and ISA certification CEU test. Additional copies may be purchased from NAA or ISA.
Proper collar cut, I need to get myself in the proper position.
I'd like to keep my lanyard position so that it's not above my shoulder.
And the higher I can get my feet up the rope with each lock, the farther I'll go with each. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at climbing spurs. Really, depending where you are in the country, they've got a lot of different names, don't they, Robert?
Yes, Rip, they do. They can be referred to as climbing hooks, climbing gaffs, climbing spurs, spikes.
In actuality, the whole unit is called a climber. We're going to be looking at some of the different components of the climber. We're going to be looking at how to properly size them, properly attach them to our leg. We're also going to be looking at proper climbing techniques, so that we can see how to safely climb up and enter into a tree using climbers. Now, while climbers can be a safe and efficient means of entering into a tree, they are very injurious to trees and really should only be used for removals or in the case of an aerial rescue. Looking here, we're going to look at some of the different components. This here is called the stirrup of the climber. This would be the shank. Here we've got the lower strap to adjust onto your foot. This is called the gaff, or the spur, and this would be the pad with the straps to adjust to the upper portion of your leg. The stirrup actually on some climbers can come in a narrow, but is predominantly in one size. Looking over at the shank, some have a permanent with no adjustment. Others, like this one here, do have an adjustment. You can see here that there are two different sizes of sleeves because some of us taller folks really need the longer adjustment. Looking down at the gaff, there are also a number of different types of gaff. Here we've got a permanent tree gaff. You notice the length of the gaff. Here we have a pole gaff. You'll notice it's a little bit shorter, and it's the replaceable type because there may be times when you can replace just the gaff. The rest of your climber is still in good shape, but the gaff needs replacing because it's worn out. Here we've got a replaceable tree gaff. So one of the nice things about the replaceable gaffs is that I could put in either a tree gaff or a pole gaff, and really it depends on the type of wood I'm climbing in. If I'm in the East Coast in a hardwood with thin bark, I may want the pole gaff. However, if I'm out in the Midwest in a cottonwood or in the far west in some of the big Doug firs or redwoods, I'm definitely going to want the longer tree gaff. Now, another thing that we've got here is the shank. Notice here I've got a straight shank here, whereas with this climber, I've got an offset shank. Some people like this because they feel it conforms a little bit better to their leg. Next, we want to look at some pads, some upper pads. Here we've got the basic L-shaped pad. You see here the portion in the front is for shin protection. You can even see here that it's marked with an L, so that we know that this goes on the left leg. It's important to put it on the proper leg. Another type of pad is this one here, the buck pad. You notice there's more material, double straps for more support. Helps keep it in place a little bit better. You really can't stress how important it is to have comfort when wearing climbers. Another type of upper pad is the Velcro wrap pad. We've got one over here. Robert's going to show how that's attached. Notice he brings it around. He'll feed it through the loop. Nice thing here is that because he can feed it through the loop, he can cinch it back down so he can get nice and tight, then bring it around and the Velcro straps it on securely to his leg. Another thing I'd like to look at here, which is very important, is proper sizing. How do you size a climber to your leg so that it fits comfortably? When Robert's sizing this here, you want to be looking at the inner part of your leg. There's a bone here on the inside of your knee. Go down to the bottom portion of that bone, and you want about 2 fingers width from the bottom of that bone to the top of the shank. And that's how to properly size the climber. So that goes to the shank, not to the pad. And then you would put in the screws, and then he can go about attaching them. Now that we've properly sized our climbers, let's look at how to attach them and strap them on. You notice here that Robert has got a heel. Now, while it isn't a very pronounced heel, many tree climbers do wear a logging style boot that has a very, very deep heel. You notice how the stirrup fits in here in front of his heel. He's attaching the upper strap first, and then he can bring the lower strap around and cinch it in so that he's got a nice, snug, and tight fit. That way, the climber will stay in place and not move around a lot. Now, while many tree climbers do wear a boot with a pronounced heel, more and more are going to a boot that has little or no heel, like this one I've got on here. Now, a number of people are under the impression that to wear climbers properly, you need a heel. But there is a technique which I can use here, and when I bring the lower strap around, I'm going to take it over the shank, then back underneath, and I can cinch that tightly, and now bring it across and tighten it up. This will keep the climber from walking or sliding off the back of my boot. But it is important to make sure that you do that properly, over and then under. That helps to cinch it down.
Yes, I can remember the first time I put Spurs on. I put them on the outside of my foot, and then found out that that wasn't the proper way to put them on my feet.
You know, it's funny, Robert, because I actually have seen a couple of people do that myself. So we've looked at a number of the different the components of the climbers. Something else that's very important is to make sure that your climbers are sharp. Otherwise, they may kick out when you're climbing up into the tree, and that can be quite dangerous. One thing that we can do is look to our manufacturer's instructions. Many manufacturers offer a sharpening kit, like this one here. You see this one comes with a flat file for sharpening. It's got a honing stone for touching up any burrs, and it comes with a little gauge that we can use to check the thicknesses and the angles. So it really is very important to make sure that they are sharp. Now, it's a little bit too complicated to go into right now on the whole technique of sharpening, but one thing I do want to mention is that you never want to take the flat file to the outer portion here, or the beehive of the gaff. You would only want to take the flat file to the underside here. What I want to do next is go over to the tree where Ken is going to show us a simple technique where we can determine if our climbers, our spurs, are sharp or not. A very simple yet effective field test for proper gaff sharpening is to come to the tree at approximately a 45-degree angle. I'll just put some pressure on the climber into the tree, and then I'll stand up and bring my heel into the tree. If the gaff is sharpened properly, I won't gaff out or slide down the tree. It will actually gaff into the tree. Robert, would you step up and talk about foot positioning, body positioning?
Some of the things we like to cover here in this segment is to understand that when climbing in a tree like this, we need to have proper distance between you and the tree. We also need to recognize that when we're going to be climbing a tree of this nature, that we don't want to put our spurs in such a position that they're so far away from, as you can see here, the center of the tree, so they're outside of the distance of my shoulders to the tree. We want to make sure that when we put our hooks in, that we put them in firmly, so that we make sure that the gaff is firmly set on the wood. And as I begin to step up, I take short steps, and I move the lanyard up as I go.
So then a proper distance for spurs out away from your center point would be maybe no farther than shoulder distance.
This is correct.
Okay. Lanyard positioning.
I'd like to keep my lanyard positioned so that it's not above my shoulders and not down below my knees. So it's being advanced as I climb, one step at a time.
Okay. When you're standing, working on spurs, and climbing for that matter, you want your knees bent, don't you?
This is correct. The last thing we want to find ourselves is in a position where we've got our legs locked straight. This has the potential for kicking out, and it's also best for your knees so that there's a slight bend in them, as you can see here.
And a beginner climber will probably take smaller steps to advance. And probably move the lanyard in between steps. After some experience and some time on climbers, you're probably going to take a bigger step, right, Bob?
This is correct.
And you've learned to flip your flip line as you advance.
Yes, I have. And as I go up into the tree and the tree begins to taper, I may need to take a little bit of slack so that I don't get too far away from the trunk of the tree.
Right. And again here, you see, Bob's knee is not locked. It's bent. That's important because a locked knee or a locked leg is not a good thing for your knee.
This is correct. One of the concerns that we need to address is on which side of the tree do we want to climb from. And as you can see here, as I swing around and I get to this side of the tree, it can become very awkward to climb on the underside of the trunk of this tree. So to facilitate climbing, it would be best to get on the back side of the trunk of the tree so as that it isn't so awkward.
That'll be a lot more comfortable.
Yes, it is. And one of the other issues to address here is in the position of this portion of my body so as to make sure that the angle of the gaff is such that it won't kick out from the trunk of the tree. If I step up and move my knee in, there is the potential for a potential kick out. So I need to have, as Ken was mentioning earlier, at about a 45-degree angle so that I make sure and get the spur to penetrate into the wood.
And I was taught a rule of thumb is to keep your butt out, and that helps facilitate the proper angle as the gaffs into the tree.
Here we'd like to go ahead and discuss a couple of reasons why we're wearing gloves. One of the reasons, obviously, is it's a very rough bark tree, and we want to protect our hands. We don't want them to have them all bloody by the time we get to the top of the tree. And we also need to discuss a little bit about where we're going to position our hands on the lanyard. So again, so we don't pinch our fingers underneath the lanyard. So as you can see, I have my hands in a position so they're just a couple inches away from the tree. So this will allow for me, when I'm climbing, to get a little bit of a slack so I can move the lanyard upward.
Okay, and the same works out for the descent.
This is correct.
Another thing is that climbing on spurs works out a lot better on a vertical stem than a horizontal stem.
This is correct.
And that has a lot to do with the fact that we've got a stirrup here, and walking on that stirrup can be very, very slippery.
Now we'd like to go ahead and have Ken give us a couple of demonstrations on some of the various techniques that we can use to go about getting around some of the limbs and some of the various lanyards that we have available that we can use to climb with.
There are a number of cases when I would choose to preset my climbing line in the tree. This one, for example, where the trunk is rather twisty, the bark plates are slippery, they're coming off, and having a climbing line aloft is a good way to go. I've gotten rather handy with a throw line over the years, so it didn't take me long to get set up here. As I step over branches on the ascent, I can go back to my climbing line, or if I'm working out on the branch to help me move up into the tree or clear my way for limbs and so forth, I can go back to my climbing line and I'll be able to work that much more securely. So that's an advantage. You notice that I have my micro pulley here on the climbing line below the climbing hitch, and Robert will tail my climbing line for me, or another way to put that would be to belay, so to speak. So as I climb, the micro pulley will slide the knot up. I'll go ahead and ascend, and Robert's going to tail my climbing line. All right, thank you, Robert. Now I'll take the climbing line back and tension it up. You'll notice I've come to a limb. If I did not have my climbing line here, set in the tree in advance, I could utilize the 2-in-1 lanyard that I have here, or the double-ended lanyard. Some people will use 2 lanyards for this type of a situation. Here I've sort of got 2 lanyards in one. Now what I'll do is bring my lanyard around the tree, above the limb. Before I clip in, I've got to remove the micro pulley. Otherwise, the lanyard will just slide. I won't be able to keep it taut. So when you change ends, you've got to remember to take the micro pulley off. Then I move up into position, clip in, and I unclip the other side, and the lanyard just simply spins around, and it works in both directions. And then I can advance. Here I had my climbing line in, but you'll notice I've been able to stay on my lanyard as well all the time. 2 forms of protection is a very good way to go. Here I'm on my primary lanyard, and I'm going to use my split tail system that I've pre-tied. I've got my knot tied. I've already got my micro pulley on the rope. I'm using a triple fisherman's loop type knot to capture my carabiner, and I'll use my split tail system as a second lanyard. We should always climb with our climbing line anyway. It's there. The split tail system just makes our rope a little more versatile, and here it acts as my second lanyard. Actually, a very, very long lanyard at that. Let's look at one more method of using a split tail in a different fashion. I'll tie a running bowline using a small loop. I'll bring my climbing hitch to my central tie-in point, and I'll have just enough slack so that I can work my loop together with my lanyard as I flip up the tree. Now, one thing I should say is that a smaller stem tree will be a lot more practicable when I'm moving that loop up and upwards, up into the tree. It would become problematic, perhaps, if I were to come to a stem or a limb, and it would be more difficult. I'd need to untie the knot before I could move over. The advantage here is one of safety, where if I were to slip or gaff out and slide where my lanyard may slide down the stem, the running bowline chokes and would stop that fall. A very important point to make here, where I'm climbing on my hitch with the climbing line anchored with the running bowline, all my weight is on the climbing hitch if I sit down. I wouldn't descend on my climbing hitch here. There'd be far too much heat and abrasion taking place and very little control. I've only got a little way to step down to the ground here, so I'll loosen my running bowline and simply step down the tree with both my lanyard and the loop.
That's some very important stuff you've been sharing here, Ken. And it shows how important it is that people learn the proper way to climb on spurs so that they don't put themselves at any undue risk.
Let's recap what we've covered today.
We started out by looking at the various components of the climbing spurs, and we looked at how to properly size and fit them to our lower leg.
We discussed techniques on climbing for getting better position so we have better control,
as well as different lanyards, use of different lanyards, how to use a climbing line when climbing on spurs. On behalf of the NAA and the ISA, this is Ken Palmer.
and Robert Phillips.
And Rip Tompkins reminding you to please climb safely.
For additional information and training materials, the NAA offers the Home Study Program for Professional Arborists and the Tailgate Safety Program, which is also available in Spanish. And from the ISA, the Complete Arbor Master Training Series and the extensively illustrated Tree Climber's Guide. This video series sponsored by Husqvarna.